The bottle tipped as the father laughed, voice thick and careless. "Take her, she's useless." The girl didn't flinch, just stood there, hands tight in her sleeves. The mountain man shifted his weight, eyes lingering a second too long before he turned away, boots crunching toward the open trail. He never turned back. He chose a rise above a narrow stream to make camp, fire catching slow against the coming dark. But as the last light drained from the sky, another set of footsteps reached the edge of his fire and stopped. Before we ride deeper into the story, hit subscribe, ring the bell, so you'll never miss another ride through the legends of the Wild West. Now, let's get back to the trail. The laugh behind him was still rattling around in Elias Boone's head by the time the trail climbed out of the low brush and into the pines. It had been the kind of laugh a man used when he wanted the world to know he felt nothing at all. Loose, mean, wet with whiskey. Elias had heard plenty like it in rough camps and bad winters, but this one stayed with him because of what came before it, not the slurred words themselves. Men said ugly things every day. It was the stillness that followed them. The girl had not cried, had not begged. She had only stood there with her hands shoved into her sleeves, as if she meant to keep herself from reaching for anybody who had no intention of reaching back. Elias walked harder than he needed to. The mountain took the trail upward in long, uneven stretches. Mud clung to his boots in the hollows. Loose stones shifted beneath him on the higher ledges. His broad coat hung open in the cooling air, fur lifting and settling with each gust, but he did not bother to close it. The cold sat better on him than most company ever had. He was a large man even at a distance, thick through the shoulders, scarred by work, more at home in weather than around voices. Dark hair fell past his shoulders in a rough line, and his beard had grown the way mountain things grew, untended, practical, part of him now. He reached a bend overlooking the lower road and stopped just long enough to listen. Nothing. Only wind moving through pine needles and the faint clatter of a jay somewhere uphill. He went on. Most days in Elias Boone's life were made of the same necessary pieces: trap line, firewood, water, meat if the mountain offered it, repair what split, mend what wore thin, speak if required, leave if possible. He had built those days carefully after burying the kind of life that used to have a table with two voices at it. Routine did not ask questions. Silence did not pity him. Up on the ridge, grief could live beside a man without being examined by neighbors who meant well and said foolish things. By the time the light began to drain out of the sky, he had chosen a place to stop for the night. A low rise sheltered from wind, stream nearby, dry wood tucked under the lip of an old fallen cedar. He dropped his pack, crouched, and struck steel to tinder. Sparks caught, smoke curled. Fire answered with a small, stubborn glow before settling into flame. Only then did he hear it again. A second rhythm under the sounds of water and crackling wood. Not animal, not imagined. He did not turn at once. He set the pot down, poured water, broke salted meat with his hands, let the silence lengthen until it had weight. Then he lifted his eyes. She stood just beyond the firelight. Mud darkened the hem of her dress. A lock of hair had come loose and stuck to one cheek. She looked tired enough to fall where she stood, but she remained upright through some private force Elias could not yet name, not defiance, not even hope exactly, something plainer. She had nowhere else to aim herself. He looked at her for a long moment. "You're a long way from that shack." "So are you," she said. Her voice surprised him, soft, yes, but not weak. It had steadiness in it, like someone who had learned early that speaking louder did not make people kinder. He returned his attention to the pot. "Go back." She did not move. "I can't." "That sounds like your problem." "That may be," she said, "but it's still true." He almost told her to leave again. Instead, he stared at the surface of the darkening water in the pot and said nothing. She had followed him for hours across a trail that would have turned back plenty of stronger people. He could hear how controlled her breathing was, which meant she was more exhausted than she wished him to know. The smell of heating meat rose with the steam. Hunger sharpened the air between them. After a while, Elias jerked his chin toward a flat stone near the edge of the fire. "Sit before you fall and make work for me." She lowered herself carefully, not with the graceless drop of someone defeated, but with the care of a person entering another person's space by permission she did not trust to last. When the food was ready, he filled one tin bowl, then another, and slid one across the ground. She caught it before it tipped. "Thank you," she said. He gave no answer. She ate as people do when they have gone too long without enough. Quickly at first, then slower when she realized he was watching without appearing to. Elias took his own supper in silence, eyes mostly on the fire. Now and then the girl looked up as if to make sure he had not changed his mind and vanished into the dark while she blinked. When both bowls were empty, the cold began working its way in earnest through the trees. Elias reached into his pack, pulled out a spare blanket, and set it on the ground. "That side of the fire," he said. She glanced at it, then at him. "You don't know me." "No." "Then why?" "Because if you freeze in the night, I'll have to deal with it in the morning." Something close to a smile touched her mouth and was gone. "That sounds like kindness disguised badly." He lay down with his back partly turned to her. "Get some sleep." For a while, the only sound was the stream moving over stone. Then from across the fire, quiet as a question not meant to be answered, she said, "My name is Clara." He stared into the black between the trees. At last he said, "Elias." She let that settle. "Thank you for the blanket, Elias." He closed his eyes. By dawn the fire was coals and the sky had gone pearl gray above the ridge. Elias rose first as always. He fed the flames, shaved curls from a piece of dry wood, boiled water, and looked out over the clearing while the world woke itself slowly. Clara stirred not long after. She sat up with a start that suggested she was not accustomed to waking anywhere safely. "You can walk?" he asked. She nodded. "I can." "Then eat." The meal was plain, coffee black enough to bite, a heel of bread, the last of the meat. Clara took only what he handed her and no more. When she finished, she rinsed both cups in the stream without being told, then returned them upside down on a flat rock to dry. Elias noticed the gesture. It was not servility. It was an offering of usefulness. They set out together because there was no practical reason not to, though Elias kept telling himself that reason was all it was. His cabin sat another half day into the hills, well beyond the point where Clara might sensibly be sent back alone. She followed at a respectful distance until the trail narrowed, then came closer where the footing grew treacherous. Once she slipped on loose shale and caught herself against a tree before he had to turn around. By the time the cabin came into view, Clara had gone very quiet. It stood in a clearing ringed by pines, rough-hewn but solid, smoke darkened around the chimney, lean-to on one side, stacked wood on the other. The place looked as if it had been built by a man who trusted beams and nails more than promises, which it had. Elias mounted the step, opened the door, and went in without ceremony. Clara stopped on the threshold. Her eyes moved over the room. Table, stove, shelf, one bed, one chair, everything plain, everything kept in its place. "This is where you live," she said. "It is." She lingered one breath longer, then stepped inside. The first hours were awkward in a manner that made Elias want to be out chopping wood, where things behaved according to effort. Clara stood with her hands folded, uncertain what she was allowed to touch. Elias put another kettle on simply because it gave him something to do. "You'll sleep near the stove," he said. "There's spare bedding in the chest." "All right. You don't go through my things." "I won't. If I say the trail's too rough, you stay put." She lifted her chin slightly. "I can manage rough trails." That wasn't a debate. A flicker crossed her face, not anger exactly, more like pride forced to sit down in too small a space. "Fine." Elias nodded once, then took up the axe and stepped back outside before the cabin could become any tighter around them. The days that followed took shape in reluctant layers. Clara remained because the nearest town was too far for her to reach safely on foot, and because spring in the mountains lied with every bright morning, then turned cruel by dusk. Elias said she could stay until weather settled, a phrase broad enough to shelter them both from naming anything more deliberate. At first, they moved around each other like strangers in a church aisle. He rose before dawn. She woke to the sounds of him already halfway through his routine. He went out to check traps, split wood, mend a section of roof, trade a hide in town if supplies ran low. She cleaned the stove, fetched water, and tried to make herself smaller than the room required, which only made Elias aware of her all the more. Then small changes began. He returned one afternoon to find the floor swept, the table scrubbed, and a tear in one of his shirts mended with neat, tight stitches. He held the shirt up. "You went through my things." "I went through the basket of clothes with a rip clear through the sleeve," she replied, standing at the stove. "If that was forbidden, you should have said so." Elias looked at the mending again. "You sew." "I can sew, wash, count stock, keep ledgers, and boil potatoes without poisoning anybody." He set the shirt down, a broad list. "It grows when necessary." That should have been the end of it. Instead, he found himself thinking about the answer later while clearing brush near the stream. Not the words, the matter-of-fact way she said them. As if usefulness were not pride to her but survival. The next day he came back to the smell of onions and rabbit stew. Clara stood over the pot with an expression of deep concentration, one hand braced on her hip. There was flour on her sleeve and soot near her wrist. "You cooked it too fast the first time," she said before he could ask. He set down the kindling in his arms. "The first time." "The day before yesterday, you browned the meat too hard." Elias stared at her. She straightened. "I noticed." "And today?" "Today, I tried not to let it die of your bad decisions." He tasted the stew. It was better than his. He did not care for that fact. He cared even less for how pleased she looked when he took a second bite. "Edible," he said. Clara's mouth twitched. "Then the mountain has truly given thanks." There were moments of friction too, real ones. She had a habit of asking why after he made a simple instruction, not to challenge him every time, but because she wished to understand the shape of the world she'd entered. Elias, who had spent years giving explanations only to weather, found this tiring. "Don't stack those near the wall," he told her one morning when she carried in fresh-cut wood. "Why?" "Because damp comes through there." She frowned at the boards. "I don't feel damp." "You'll feel rot later." "Then say rot later." He looked at her, she looked back. Then, unexpectedly, he heard himself say, "Rot later." Clara laughed, not loudly, not at him in cruelty. Just with such surprised warmth that the whole room seemed to brighten around it. Elias turned away before she could see his face. A week after that, he took her to town. He told himself it was practical. Mrs. Kettering at the general store needed help 3 mornings a week after her niece married off and moved south. Clara could earn enough to buy what she wanted without feeling beholden. And if Clara worked in town, people would stop asking Elias what business he had bringing an unknown woman in and out of the hills. It was practical. That did not explain why he watched so closely the first morning Clara stood behind the store counter, tying parcels with twine. Mrs. Kettering, a square-shouldered widow with good eyes and no patience for nonsense, took to Clara inside of an hour. "She raps cleaner than my nephew and speaks clearer than my brother," the older woman declared while rearranging jars of coffee. "That's already put her above most of the county." Clara smiled. "Your standards sound sensible." "My standards are exhausted," Mrs. Kettering said. "You'll do." Elias leaned one shoulder against the door frame, arms folded, pretending not to listen. Mrs. Kettering gave him a sideways glance. "You can stop glowering. I'm hiring her, not stealing her." "I'm not glowering." "You always look like you're considering whether a room deserves to keep standing." Clara bent her head quickly, but not before Elias saw the smile she tried to hide. He left the store with less dignity than he preferred, and spent the rest of the day irritated by how often he pictured Clara there among bolts of cloth and sacks of flour, talking easily to strangers in a way that would never have occurred to him. But town agreed with her, or she with it. Children gravitated toward her. So did old men with too much time and stories they told everyone twice. She learned who owed Mrs. Kettering money and who only needed a little grace until harvest. She began bringing home scraps of talk from town in the evenings. "Mr. Dobbins swears his rooster can predict storms." "It can't." "I know, it predicted sunshine and got soaked." Elias looked up from skinning a rabbit. Maybe the rooster's optimistic. Clara paused. Was that a joke? No. It sounded dangerously near one. He returned to his work, but she went on smiling for several minutes. Their life, such as it was, started to gather familiar seams. Clara at the table with a ledger from the store, tongue pressed lightly to one corner of her mouth while she added columns. Elias carving pegs by lamplight. Shared coffee before dawn if she happened to wake early. Supper taken in stretches of quiet that no longer felt strained. Once, in a hard rain, she came in drenched through and shivering. Elias wordlessly set another log on the fire, hung her wet shawl closer to the heat, and handed her his own dry blanket. She took it without arguing. Later, as she returned it folded, she said, "You are kinder when you don't speak." "That seems convenient for you." "It may be." He looked at her over the rim of his cup. "Careful." "With what?" "You're getting used to me." Clara lowered her eyes to the blanket in her hands. "I know." The quiet that followed held something new in it. Not peace exactly, not yet, but awareness. One Saturday, while Elias repaired a broken gate to the goat pen behind Mrs. Kettering's store, Clara came outside carrying a basket of unsold bread rolls. She set it down near him. "These were deemed too misshapen for customers," she said. "Mrs. Kettering says that means they're fit for workers and family." He glanced into the basket. "Which am I?" Clara seemed to consider it. "Hungry." That answer got closer to a smile out of him than anything had in months. She noticed, so did he. Later, while they walked the trail home under a sky turning amber at the edges, Clara stumbled on a root half hidden by grass. Elias caught her elbow before she went down. The contact lasted no more than a second, but both of them felt it. Clara straightened. Elias let go, neither spoke of it. At the cabin that night, the room felt smaller in a way that had nothing to do with walls. Clara rolled dough for biscuits with more force than needed. Elias sharpened a knife that was already sharp. Now and then one of them would glance up, only to find the other doing the same. It passed, or seemed to. The next morning, Clara found him outside building a second chair. She stood on the step, arms folded against the cool air, expecting company. Elias kept his attention on the plane in his hands. "You've been sitting on a crate for 2 weeks. I have sat on worse things. That doesn't recommend them." She came down into the yard, watching him fit the back rail into place. "So this is not for company." "No. For me, then." He set the piece down and finally looked at her. "Unless you'd rather the crate." Clara's expression changed in a way so small another man might have missed it. Surprise first, then something softer. "The chair will do." He nodded, "Thought so." That evening she sat in it by the fire while hemming a dish towel, and Elias found himself working more slowly than usual just to stay in the room longer and listen to the quiet scratch of her needle. He did not yet call what was happening by its rightful name. He was not ready. But he knew the mountain had changed, or perhaps only the life inside his cabin had. There was a second chair now, a jar of wildflowers Clara had gathered near the stream, bread cooling on cloth, a woman's voice in the evening, none of it loud, none of it dramatic, yet each thing pressed, gently and steadily, against the walls he had lived behind. And when night came, and he lay in the dark listening to the faint turn of Clara settling near the stove, Elias Boone understood something he had spent years refusing. Silence had kept him alive, but it had never once made him feel less alone. Morning came slow over the ridge, pale light slipping through the trees in thin, quiet strands. Elias was already awake before it reached the fire, sitting on a low rock with a knife in hand, shaving a strip of wood into clean curls. The motion was steady, practiced, his attention fixed on the small, precise work. Across from him, Clara stirred beneath the blanket. She didn't rise right away. Instead, she lay still for a moment, as if testing whether the place around her would still be there when she opened her eyes. It was. She pushed herself up, brushing stray strands of hair from her face, and looked toward him. "You're up early," she said. "I'm always up early." She nodded like she'd expected that answer. There was no awkwardness in her movement now, not like the night before. She folded the blanket carefully, slower than necessary, but with clear intention, then set it where she thought it belonged, near his pack, not too close, not tossed aside. Elias noticed. He didn't say anything. They ate in quiet, what little remained from the night before, stretched thin with water. Clara didn't wait to be told this time. She took her portion, small as it was, and made it last. When she finished, she rinsed the tin without being asked, carrying water from the stream with careful steps. Elias watched her once, briefly, then returned to his work. They broke camp not long after. Elias packed in silence, movements efficient, leaving no trace behind but pressed grass and cooling ash. Clara stood ready before he told her to move, as if she'd already learned the rhythm. When he started down the trail, she followed. He didn't tell her to stop. The path cut deeper into the mountains that day, narrower, steeper. The ground shifted from soft mud to rock and root, the air thinning with height. Clara kept up as best she could, though her steps grew slower by midday. Elias adjusted his pace once, just once. It was enough. By late afternoon, the trees opened into a clearing where a small structure stood, rough-built, weathered, but solid. His cabin. Clara stopped just short of it. "This is yours?" she asked. Elias set his pack down by the door. "It is." She didn't step forward right away. Her gaze moved over the place, the stacked wood, the narrow windows, the small lean-to along one side. It wasn't much, but it was steady, permanent. "Go on," he said, pushing the door open. She entered like she expected to be told she didn't belong the moment she crossed the threshold. Inside, the cabin held the same order as everything Elias touched. Sparse, clean, every item placed where it served a purpose. A table near the window, a stove, a single bed pushed against the far wall. No second chair. Clara noticed that too. She stood just inside, hands folded lightly now, not tucked away like before, waiting. Elias moved past her, setting his things down. "You'll take the floor," he said. "There's space near the stove." She nodded. "That's fine." There was no complaint in her voice, no disappointment, just acceptance. The first few days passed in a quiet pattern. Elias left at dawn, returning with what the mountain gave him, small game, kindling, whatever he needed to keep going. Clara stayed behind at first, unsure where she was allowed to step, what she was allowed to touch. But she didn't stay idle. By the second day, the stove was clean before he returned. By the third, the water was already boiling when he stepped inside. By the fourth, she'd found a way to mend a tear in his coat without asking, the stitches tight and careful. Elias noticed everything. Said nothing. On the fifth morning, he left an extra portion of dried meat on the table before he went. Clara found it. She didn't mention it when he returned, but she cooked it better than he ever had. There was a quiet shift after that. She moved with more certainty, less hesitation. The cabin began to change in ways so small they might have gone unseen by anyone else. A cloth folded neatly over the table, a stack of wood arranged closer to the door, a cup set out before he asked for it. Elias found himself pausing in the doorway more often, taking in the space like it belonged to someone else for a moment. It didn't feel as empty. One afternoon, he returned to find her outside, struggling with a bucket of water that was clearly too heavy for her to carry alone. He watched for a second, then stepped forward, taking the handle without a word. She looked up, surprised. "I had it." "Not well," he said, carrying it the rest of the way. She followed beside him, not arguing, but not shrinking either. "I'll manage next time," she said. Elias set the bucket down. "You'll learn." There was no sharpness in it, just truth. She smiled, small but real. "I will." Days turned into weeks. Clara began to venture farther from the cabin, first just to the edge of the clearing, then along the shorter trails Elias used. He showed her how to read the ground, how to step where it held firm, how to listen for the difference between wind and movement. She learned quickly, not perfectly, but enough. On one trip into town, Elias brought her along. It wasn't planned. He simply didn't tell her to stay behind. The town was small, the kind where faces were known and changes didn't go unnoticed. When Elias stepped onto the main stretch with Clara a half step behind him, conversations dipped, then resumed in quieter tones. Clara felt it. She kept her gaze steady, though her hands tightened slightly at her sides. Inside the general store, Elias gathered what he needed: flour, salt, a new length of rope. Clara lingered near the shelves, studying items like she was trying to memorize their purpose. The storekeeper, an older woman with sharp eyes and a softer voice, approached her. "You new out here?" she asked. Clara hesitated, something like that. The woman nodded, glancing toward Elias. "He don't bring folks in often." "I gathered that." There was a faint humor in Clara's voice now, careful but present. The woman smiled. "You looking for work?" Clara blinked, caught off guard. "Work?" Store could use a pair of steady hands. Nothing fancy, just help with stock and keeping things in order. Clara glanced toward Elias, who stood at the counter, unaware of the conversation. I can do that," she said. "Then come by tomorrow," the woman replied. "We'll see how you manage." Clara nodded, something bright flickering behind her eyes. When they left, she walked beside Elias, quieter than usual. "You don't have to," he said after a while. She looked at him. "Have to what?" "Work there, stay here, either one." Clara considered that. "I want to," she said simply. Elias nodded once. That was enough. Her days shifted after that. Mornings at the store, afternoons back at the cabin, evenings shared in the quiet they'd begun to understand together. Elias noticed the change in her, the way she stood a little straighter, the way she spoke with more certainty. The way she laughed, soft, unexpected but real. He noticed something else too. He started listening for it. One evening, rain came down sudden and hard, turning the ground slick and the air sharp with cold. Clara returned later than usual, her steps hurried, her clothes damp from the storm. Elias stepped outside just as she reached the edge of the clearing. "You're late." "The road slowed me," she said, breath uneven. She took one step forward and slipped. It happened fast. Her foot lost its hold on the wet ground, her balance tipping before she could catch it. Elias moved without thinking, crossing the space between them in 2 strides. His hand caught her arm, the other braced her back. For a moment they held there, close, closer than they'd ever been. Rain traced along her face, catching in her lashes. His grip was firm, steady, his breath quiet but present between them. Neither of them moved, not right away. Clara looked up at him, something unguarded in her expression. Elias felt it, sharp and unfamiliar. He let go first, stepped back. "You need better footing," he said, voice rougher than before. She nodded, though her gaze lingered a moment longer. "I'll be more careful." They went inside without another word, but something had shifted. Elias felt it in the way the cabin held the quiet that night. Not empty, not heavy, just aware. The next morning he left before she woke. He stayed out longer than necessary. The mountains felt different now, not because they'd changed, but because something in him had. He found himself thinking of her in small, unexpected ways, whether she'd eaten, whether she'd remembered to keep the fire steady, whether she'd laugh at something the storekeeper said. He didn't like it, didn't trust it. By the time he returned, the light was already fading. Clara was inside, seated at the table, a small ledger open in front of her. She looked up when he entered. "You're late." He paused, then gave a small, humorless breath. "So are you." She smiled at that. It stayed with him longer than it should have. A few days later, a man from town stopped by the cabin, a trader passing through, someone Elias had dealt with before. He took one look at the place, then at Clara moving about the room, and gave a low whistle. "Didn't think I'd see the day," he said. Elias frowned. "See what?" "Your place, looking like someone lives in it." Elias didn't answer. The man leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Careful, Boone, things like this, they don't stay simple." Elias' jaw tightened. "They don't need to." The man studied him for a moment, then nodded, like he'd said what he came to say. After he left, the cabin felt different again, quieter. Elias stood by the door for a long time, staring out into the trees. Clara didn't interrupt. That night she spoke softly from across the room. "I used to think, if I stayed quiet enough, useful enough, people might keep me." Elias didn't turn. "They didn't," she added. The words settled between them, heavier than anything she'd said before. He sat down slowly, resting his forearms on his knees. "I don't keep people," he said. "I know." There was no hurt in it, just understanding, and I'm not asking you to. Silence stretched. Then Elias spoke again, quieter now. "I had a wife." Clara didn't move. She got sick. Winter came early that year. Roads closed before I could get help. His voice didn't break, but something in it shifted. "I buried her behind this cabin," he said. "Didn't leave for months after." Clara's breath caught barely. Elias stared at the floor, as if the memory sat there. "I built everything around not feeling that again," he continued. "Every day, every step." He let out a slow breath. "And now you're here." It wasn't accusation. It wasn't blame. It was something closer to confusion. Clara stood, crossing the room slowly, stopping a few steps away. "I didn't come to take anything from you," she said. "I just didn't have anywhere else to go." Elias nodded once. "I know." He rubbed a hand over his face, rough, tired. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then something gave, not loud, not sudden, just enough. Elias leaned forward, elbows on his knees, head lowering slightly as if the weight of it all had finally found somewhere to settle. Clara didn't rush to him, didn't touch him. She simply stayed, close enough, present, and that was what broke it. Not tears, not yet, but the quiet understanding that he didn't have to carry it alone anymore. The fire burned low. The night stretched on. And for the first time, since the mountains had taken everything from him, Elias didn't try to push it all back down. The morning after Elias finally spoke of his wife, the cabin felt changed in a way Clara could not have named aloud. Nothing inside had moved. The stove still stood where it always had. The shelf beside the wall still held its row of plain tins. The blankets were folded the same. The chair near the window leaned at the same slight angle where one leg sat shorter than the rest. But the quiet had shifted. It no longer felt like a locked room. Elias rose before dawn as he always did. Clara heard him moving through the dark, the careful steps of a man who had spent years knowing every board by memory. She kept her eyes closed, though she was awake when he stirred the coals and fed the stove. He moved with less hardness than usual, not because he had become easy overnight, but because something in him was tired from holding itself shut. When she finally sat up, he was already dressed for the morning, broad shoulders filling the space near the door, his long hair tied back loosely. Cold light framed him from behind. His fur coat hung open like it always did, as if the mountain belonged to him more than any fire ever could. He stood there a moment, one hand on the latch, before speaking without turning around. "There's flour in the sack by the stove," he said, "and dried apples in the shelf tin." Clara blinked, surprised by the ordinary nature of the words. "All right," she answered. He gave a small nod, then stepped outside. It was not much, just a sentence. Just flour and dried apples. But for Elias Boone, it was invitation. By mid-morning, the cabin held the smell of apple cakes browning in the pan, the sweet edge of fruit softening in heat, the richer scent of bacon grease warming the iron. Clara stood over the stove with one sleeve rolled higher than the other, brow furrowed in concentration. She had dusted flour over herself without realizing it. A pale streak crossed her cheek. Another marked the front of her dress. When Elias came back through the door with split wood against one shoulder, he stopped. Clara looked over. "Is something wrong?" He set the wood down one piece at a time. "Depends." She frowned. "On what?" "On whether that smell means breakfast or a fire about to start in my pan." She looked quickly at the stove, then at the cakes. "It's breakfast." Bold claim. There was no sting in it, just the ghost of dry humor. Clara stared at him for a beat, then lifted one cake with the edge of the knife and set it on a plate. "Then you may judge it." Elias took the plate, sat at the table and cut off a piece. He chewed slowly. Clara tried very hard not to watch him, failed. "Well?" she asked. He swallowed. "It's edible." Her face fell in exaggerated disappointment. "Edible." He took another bite. "Better than what I make." That earned the smile he had expected and strangely waited for. After that morning, small changes kept arriving on quiet feet. Clara stopped moving around the cabin like an unwanted guest. She moved like someone mindful of another person's space, yes, but no longer afraid of her own. Elias came back from the trail one afternoon to find her kneeling near the far corner, scrubbing the floorboards with hot water and a rag gone black in her hands. The place smelled of pine soap she must have bartered for in town. He stood watching longer than he intended. Clara sat back on her heels and pushed a damp strand of hair from her face. It was beginning to look like a stable floor. He glanced around, so now it looks like a clean, stable floor. She laughed under her breath. "That's more praise than you think." He turned away so she would not see the corner of his mouth shift. In town, Clara's footing grew steadier too. Mrs. Kettering at the general store discovered quickly that Clara had a neat hand, a good memory, and a way with restless customers. She could calm a fretful child with half a smile and no fuss. She wrapped parcels square and tight. She remembered who took sugar on credit and who paid in full. When older men came in grumbling about prices, she listened without flinching and somehow sent them away with exactly what they needed and none of the argument they had brought with them. "She's got more sense than most of the county," Mrs. Kettering told Elias one afternoon while Clara was in the back sorting bolts of cloth, "and a straighter spine than folks twice her age." Elias glanced toward the rear room, where Clara's voice drifted faintly as she counted inventory under her breath. "She works hard," he said. Mrs. Kettering gave him a look that missed very little. "So do mules. I wasn't talking about hard work." Elias said nothing. Mrs. Kettering folded her arms. "You best not wait too long to know what you've got." He picked up the sack of flour he'd come for. "I came for supplies, not advice." "Then next time, I'll charge extra for both." That drew a low sound from him, not quite a laugh, but close enough that the storekeeper's brows rose in satisfaction. Clara came out carrying a crate of canned peaches and caught only the end of it. "What happened?" "Nothing," Elias said. Mrs. Kettering smiled too innocently. "Your mountain man here nearly smiled." Clara looked from one to the other. "That would explain the weather." Elias lifted the sack to his shoulder and headed for the door before either woman could see the warmth that had touched his face. Clara followed with the rest of the supplies, and though she said nothing until they were halfway up the road, he could feel her amusement beside him. "It would explain the weather," he repeated at last. She kept her eyes ahead. It seemed fitting. You're getting bold. I'm getting accustomed. That answer stayed with him the rest of the day. Spring leaned into summer by slow degrees. Snow withdrew from the high shade. The stream beside the cabin ran fuller, louder, clear enough to catch the light in trembling silver bands. The clearing greened. Wild grasses pushed through old ground, and the smell of thawed earth gave way to warmer things. More than once, Elias found himself standing at the edge of the yard at dusk, watching Clara move about the place as if it had always needed two people. She hung fresh-washed cloth where the light could reach it longest. She set herbs to dry near the window after Mrs. Kettering showed her which ones eased coughs and which settled the stomach. She learned to split kindling cleanly, though the larger logs still made her swear softly under her breath when the axe glanced wrong. One evening, Elias came around the side of the cabin and found her glaring down at a stubborn round of pine that refused to break. "It knows you're impatient," he said. She turned, hand braced on the axe handle. "I am not impatient. You're arguing with wood. It started it." He crossed the yard and took the axe from her, not because she could not do it, but because he wanted to stand near her for a moment and had not learned how to admit such things. He set the log straight, measured the grain, and split it in one clean strike. Clara folded her arms. "Show off." He handed the axe back. "Again." She tried, missed the line, and the axe head sank awkwardly into the side. Elias stepped behind her without thinking, one hand lightly closing over hers on the handle, the other steadying the angle of her elbow. "Not force," he murmured. "Placement." Clara went still, so did he. The nearness came all at once, the warmth of her through the worn fabric of her sleeve, the scent of soap and cut grass at her collar, the feel of her breath caught and held for one silent second longer than it should have been. Elias released her and stepped back at once. "There," he said, voice rougher than he meant. "Try it that way." Clara brought the axe down and split the wood cleanly. She looked at the pieces on the ground, then up at him, though neither of them spoke of what had just passed between them. That night he stayed outside long after dark, mending a trap by firelight he did not need. The trouble did not begin with one grand moment. Elias would almost have preferred that. A single bolt of feeling could be fought or named or turned away. This was worse. It came in pieces. In the way he noticed, when Clara tucked her hair behind her ear while reading the labels on jars she did not yet trust herself to remember. In the way she hummed sometimes while kneading dough, always under her breath, as though the tune belonged more to her hands than her voice. In the way the cabin no longer felt like a place he endured until sleep, but somewhere he returned to. He found himself listening for her boots on the path from town, counting the evenings by when she came through the door. Once, when she was late, he walked halfway down the trail before he realized what he was doing. He stopped there under the pines, angry with himself for the haste in his chest. Then Clara came into view, carrying a paper parcel and a bunch of early meadow flowers misses. Kettering's niece had pressed on her, saying the cabin looked like it needed color. Clara looked startled to see him. "Something wrong?" she asked. Elias answered too quickly, "No." She studied him, then the parcel in her arms shifted and nearly slipped. He caught it before it fell, warm bread, a length of ribbon, a handful of blue flowers bent from the trip. "You walked out this far for no reason?" she asked softly. He handed the parcel back. Trail was clear. That little sound held more than he cared for. Later she placed the flowers in a jar on the table. He pretended not to see them and noticed them every time he passed. For Clara, the change in him was harder to read, but impossible to miss. Elias did not speak much more than before, yet his silences had altered. He no longer shut her out with them. When she told him something from town, he listened. Sometimes he even asked a question after. When she mentioned that Mrs. Kettering's nephew was courting the schoolteacher badly and with more confidence than skill, Elias grunted, "Badly how?" Clara nearly dropped the spoon she was drying. "Did you just ask for gossip?" I asked for facts." She laughed so hard she had to lean against the table. Elias watched her, and the sight of her laughing in his cabin struck him with such unexpected force that he looked away first. It should have been simple after the night he spoke of his wife. It should have made things easier. Instead, it made them dangerous, because now Clara knew the shape of the wound, and Elias knew she had not turned from it. One Saturday, the town held a small summer gathering near the churchyard. Tables laid out with pies and preserves, children racing in crooked lines across the grass, men pretending not to care who won the horseshoe toss. Clara had not planned to stay long after her work at the store, but Mrs. Kettering insisted, and when Elias came down the road with a rolled hide to trade, Clara found herself standing beside him near the edge of the crowd. "You can leave if you want," she said, noticing the tightness in his shoulders. He looked over the gathering. "I know." But he did not leave. They stood together beneath the shade of a cottonwood while town life moved around them, not apart, not yet belonging in any public sense either, just there. A little girl ran past and nearly collided with Clara's skirts. Elias' hand came out on instinct, settling lightly at Clara's waist to guide her aside before the child could knock into her. It was the briefest touch, steady, protective, public. Clara felt it like a struck match. So did Elias. He dropped his hand at once, but the place where it had rested seemed to hold its own memory. Mrs. Kettering, watching from behind the pie table, looked heavenward as though asking for patience with slow men. Later, a fiddler began playing under the church steps. Couples gathered without much ceremony. Some laughed through the tune. Others moved with the ease of people who had done so at every community supper for 20 years. Clara watched them with quiet pleasure, not longing exactly, just interest. Elias noticed, "You dance." She glanced at him, "Not well." "That hasn't stopped half the people here." "It might stop me." For a moment he said nothing. Then, in a tone so even she nearly missed the offer inside it, he said, "Could learn." She turned fully toward him. "Is that your way of asking?" "No." A beat passed, "Then it's your way of nearly asking." His gaze held hers for a long moment, and something in it warmed and darkened all at once. Then Mr. Kettering called him over about a trade matter, and the moment broke before either of them could decide what to do with it. That evening on the walk home, the distance between them felt charged by everything unsaid. Clara carried her shoes in one hand to spare the leather from a muddy stretch. Elias carried the basket of things she'd taken from town. When she slipped once on the bank, he put out a hand automatically. She took it, crossed the slick ground, and let go only when she had to. His palm stayed open a second longer than necessary. At the cabin, he set the basket down and went outside again. Clara stood in the doorway, watching his broad back disappear into twilight. He spent nearly an hour at the far edge of the clearing, fixing a fence that did not need repair. The next days were worse, or better, depending on which part of Elias a man chose to obey. He withdrew without meaning to, then with full intention once he recognized the slide. He left earlier, stayed out later. When he spoke, he kept it plain and practical. "Wood, rain coming, need more salt. The snare by the stream needs mending." Clara answered in the same measure. She had learned enough not to chase a man who was wrestling something he could not yet name aloud. But the distance settled over the cabin like a draft under the door, thin, persistent, impossible not to feel. Still, life insisted on itself. Bread needed kneading, stores needed tending, sheets needed washing. Mrs. Kettering sent over a basket of green beans one morning because the garden-'s gotten ahead of my patience, and Clara spent the afternoon snapping them into a bowl while Elias sharpened his skinning knife at the table. The silence between them stretched and softened and stretched again. Finally, Clara said, "You've worn a groove in that whetstone." Elias kept working, "Need a sharper blade." She snapped another bean in half, "Or a duller mood." He stopped only for a heartbeat, then resumed, "You talk more when you're bothered." And you speak less. That seems difficult. It is. That pulled the faintest breath of amusement from him, gone almost as quickly as it came. Clara set the bowl down and looked at him. You don't have to tell me what to do with your grief, Elias, but if you mean to freeze me out every time you feel something, you ought to say so plain. His hand stilled on the knife. The room held itself still with him. Then he set the blade down carefully, as if careless movement might make something worse. I don't know what to do with it, he said. Clara's face softened, but she did not move closer yet. That, she answered quietly, is the plainest thing you've said in weeks. He looked at her then, properly looked, the bowl of beans between them, the afternoon light across her sleeve, the steady courage in a woman who had once followed him through dark because there had been nowhere else to go, and who now sat in his home speaking truth to him without flinching. I think of her, he said, then I think of you. Clara waited, and it feels like disloyalty, he finished, each word rough as though dragged over stone. Like opening one hand means I've dropped the other. She let the silence live a moment before answering. You don't love the dead by refusing the living. Elias closed his eyes, not because the words hurt, because they were true. That night rain began after supper, soft at first, then steady enough to wrap the cabin in its own wet hush. Clara sat near the stove, darning a shirt cuff. Elias stood by the window looking out into darkness that showed him nothing. He had spent years believing endurance was the same as honor, that if he held himself to the shape grief had made, he was being faithful. Now he was no longer sure whether he had been loyal. Or simply afraid. When he finally turned, Clara was threading the needle again, head bent, concentration narrowing her expression. It struck him how many nights like this had already passed, how naturally she belonged in the picture before him, not as a ghostly interruption, not as charity. As herself, he crossed the room and sat opposite her. Clara glanced up. What is it? The answer rose, stopped, changed. I buried my wife with my own hands, he said. Snow to my knees, ground hard enough to break the shovel edge twice. Clara laid the shirt across her lap and listened. I remember thinking the world ought to stop with it, just stop entirely, but it didn't. Sun came up next morning, frost melted on the fence rail, men down in town bought coffee and argued over mule prices. He laughed once, bitter and brief. I hated them for it. Her eyes never left his face. I came up here because the mountain didn't ask anything of me, didn't expect me to be whole, didn't care if I never laughed again. He rubbed a hand over his beard. Then you came along with your flower on your face, and your way of speaking to old women and children and woodpiles like they ought to answer back. At that, despite the tears already brightening her eyes, Clara smiled. Elia's voice thinned, and I started noticing mornings again. The words broke something open in him. His shoulders bowed as if under weight he had carried so long he no longer knew how to set it down. He pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes, but the grief came anyway, not loud, not theatrical, just the deep, tired sorrow of a man who had held too much too quietly for too many years. Clara rose and crossed to him then, not in haste, not in alarm. She knelt beside his chair and rested one hand gently over his clenched fist. He did not pull away. For a long moment there was only rain on the roof and the broken shape of his breathing. When he finally lowered his hands, his eyes were wet and unguarded, and the sight of him that vulnerable would have undone any woman with less heart than Clara possessed. I don't know how to do this, he said. You already are, she answered. He looked at her hand over his, turned his palm beneath it until his fingers held hers back. That was all. No dramatic vow, no grand rescue. Just a hand clasped in lamplight while the storm passed outside. But after that night, distance no longer fit between them the way it had before. Not because they rushed. They did not. The nearness grew by honest degrees, like a fire that had been fed steadily enough to warm the whole room without anyone noticing the exact moment it ceased being small. Elias began coming back earlier, Clara stopped pretending not to wait for the sound of his boots. Some evenings they sat on the cabin steps after supper while swallows dipped over the clearing. He would carve at a piece of cedar. She would shell peas into a bowl. Sometimes they spoke. Sometimes they let the world say enough. Once, when Clara dozed in the chair with a book slipped sideways in her lap, Elias lifted the fallen blanket from the floor and settled it over her without waking her. He stood there longer than necessary, looking down at the loosened hair at her temple, the soft parting of her lips in sleep, the peace on a face that had once learned to expect none. The next morning she found the blanket and said nothing, but her eyes met his over the coffee cup with quiet knowledge. Another time he returned from town with a pair of sturdy new boots in his hand. Clara stared at them. "Those are not yours." "No, they're expensive. They're practical." She looked up. "Elias." He set them on the table. "The soles on yours were near gone. I could have managed longer." "I know." There it was again, his care arriving disguised as plain statement. Clara ran her fingers over the leather. "Thank you." He gave a brief nod. "Try them on before I'm told I guessed wrong." She did. They fit perfectly. Mrs. Kettering received the news of this purchase with such open satisfaction that Clara finally said, "If you smile any harder, your face may split." Mrs. Kettering sniffed. "I've lived long enough to appreciate seeing men learn sense." By the turn of autumn, the cabin no longer resembled the house Clara had first entered. Curtains hung at the window now, sewn from simple cloth bought in town. Herbs dried from the rafters in neat bunches. The table bore marks of shared use, flour dust, thread snips, one stubborn ring from a coffee cup Elias always forgot to move from the same spot. The chair by the stove had been repaired. A second chair had appeared beside it. Elias built that one himself. Clara noticed and ran a hand over the smoothed back rail. "So now I'm permanent enough for furniture." He met her gaze from across the room. "You were permanent before the chair." The air between them went still. Neither spoke. Then Clara, because she had grown brave in the presence of a man who rewarded truth, said softly, "That sounded dangerously close to saying what you mean." Elias crossed the room before he could think better of it. He stopped near enough that she had to tilt her head back slightly to keep looking at him. Light from the stove touched one side of her face and left the other in a softer shadow. His chest rose once, slowly. "I spend half my days trying not to say it wrong," he said, "and the other half trying not to say it at all." Clara's expression gentled. "Then say it plain." He looked at her for a long time, as if he had traveled a greater distance to reach that moment than any mountain trail could account for. "When you first followed me," he said, "I thought you were another burden I'd have to carry until I could set it down somewhere." She waited, steady and open. "You were not a burden. You were—" He paused, searching, unwilling to lie even by reaching for prettier words than truth supplied. "You were the first thing that made this place feel like life instead of waiting." Clara inhaled shakily. Elias went on, voice low and honest. "You changed the sound of this house, the look of morning, the weight of evening. I notice when you laugh. I notice when you're late. I notice when you're quiet and when you are not." His eyes held hers with no place left to hide. "And I am afraid of it. Afraid because I loved once and lost it. Afraid because wanting this much feels like standing where the ground gave way before." Clara's eyes shone now, but she did not look away. "But," he said, the word catching and then settling, "I am more afraid of a life where I keep turning from you because I mistook fear for loyalty." The room felt held in two hands. "I love you, Clara." No flourish, no grand rhetoric, just a plain sentence from a plain man, which was why it landed with the force of a vow. Clara's breath left her in something like a laugh, something like a sob. She lifted her hand and laid it against his chest, over the steady strength there, the warmth. You stubborn, careful man, she whispered. I have known for weeks. That pulled a startled half-smile from him, and you let me wrestle with it alone. Not alone, she said, just slowly, it seemed your way. His hand came up to cover hers. I love you too, she said, not because you rescued me, not because you gave me shelter, because you are good without display and gentle when you think no one sees it, and because this place feels like home when you walk through the door. The last of his restraint gave way then, not violently, not with desperation, but with the quiet certainty of a man finally stepping onto ground he trusts to hold. He bent and kissed her. It was not hurried, not possessive. It was the kind of kiss built by withheld things finally granted room to breathe, warm, careful, and deepened by relief. Clara rose onto her toes to meet him, one hand still at his chest, the other lifting to the rough line of his beard. When they drew back, their foreheads touched. Elias let out a breath that sounded almost like wonder. So, Clara said softly, smiling against his mouth, that is what nearly asking at the churchyard was about. He huffed a laugh. Took you long enough. She stared at him in mock offense. I have crossed mountains and survived your cooking. Do not grow bold all at once. He kissed her again before she could finish the thought. After that, life did not transform into endless ease. It became better than ease. It became shared. They moved forward in the manner that suited them, without spectacle, with steadiness. Clara still worked at the store 3 days a week. Elias still trapped, traded, cut wood, repaired what needed repairing, but their motions bent around each other now without fear. Some mornings she rose with him and stood wrapped in a shawl on the step while dawn spread pale over the trees. Some evenings he met her on the trail back from town and took the heavier parcel without being asked. On Sundays, when weather allowed, they walked together to the churchyard gathering or along the stream, saying little and needing little more. Town noticed, of course. Mrs. Kettering noticed most loudly. Well, she declared one afternoon, as Clara measured out sugar for a customer, I was beginning to suspect Boone planned to court you until both of you turned gray. Clara, who had already been kissed senseless twice that week in the quiet between supper and sleep, kept her face admirably composed. Perhaps gray is the aim. Mrs. Kettering snorted. Then he best hurry. Men waste their youth thinking silence counts as character. When Elias appeared in the doorway later that day, Mrs. Kettering greeted him with, You're late. He looked mildly alarmed. For what? Common sense, mostly. Clara bit the inside of her cheek to keep from laughing. Snow came early that year, but it found the cabin ready. Wood stood stacked high under cover. Jars lined the shelves in neat ranks. Beans, peaches, preserves, broth. Clara had learned to can under Mrs. Kettering's supervision and stern warning not to waste lids. A thicker curtain now covered the door at night to keep drafts down. Elias repaired the roof before the worst weather set in. Clara knitted him a scarf he insisted was unnecessary and wore every morning after. One evening, as the first real storm rolled in, Elias set a small box on the table between them. Clara looked up from the dough she was kneading. What is that? Open it. Inside lay a plain gold band, not ornate, but solid and bright in the lamplight. Clara looked at it, then at him. Elias stood with one hand resting on the chair back, large and suddenly almost uncertain despite his size. I know I'm late to most things worth saying, he began, but I would rather be late than fail to say them at all. Clara's eyes filled at once. He came around the table and stopped before her. Marry me, he said. Stay because you choose it. Stay because this is yours too. Stay because I would like every morning I've got left to begin with you in it. Clara laughed through her tears, flowers still on her hands. You asked me in the middle of bread. It seemed honest. She touched the ring with one fingertip. It does. Then she lifted her face and answered with the only word he truly needed. Yes. They were married in late winter, when the snow still lay bright in the fields, but the days had begun stretching longer. The church was small and full beyond comfort, because apparently half the county felt entitled to witness the miracle of Elias Boone standing before a preacher in a clean shirt. Mrs. Kettering cried openly, and Denny did afterward. Mr. Kettering shook Elias' hand with such solemn satisfaction that one might have thought he himself had arranged the match through livestock exchange. Clara wore a simple cream dress, altered from one Mrs. Kettering had saved for years in case of need. Elias stood beside her with his hair tied back, beard trimmed, broad shoulders held in a quiet steadiness that did not hide how much the moment meant to him. When the preacher asked the vows, Elias spoke clearly. When he placed the ring on Clara's finger, his large hand trembled once, only once. Their home changed further after marriage, not because it had lacked love before, but because love now moved unhidden through it. Clara painted the second chair blue in a burst of confidence Elias tolerated with elaborate resignation. He built shelves for the books Mrs. Kettering kept pressing on Clara from a niece back east. They planted a small kitchen garden in spring, argued gently over where the beans ought to go, and discovered by midsummer that both of them had been wrong and the beans preferred the back fence after all. There was laughter then, more than Elias would once have believed possible. There was a dog too, eventually, an ugly brown thing with oversized paws and a habit of stealing socks from the wash line. Clara adored him at once. Elias objected for nearly 3 days before the creature fell asleep on his boot while he whittled and thus secured permanent residence. Years did not rush. They gathered. One autumn evening, as leaves burned copper against the ridge and smoke from the chimney lifted straight into still air, Clara stood in the doorway with a hand resting lightly at the swell beneath her apron. Elias, coming in with an armload of wood, stopped so abruptly one log slipped free and landed on the threshold. Clara smiled, soft, and a little shy despite everything they had already shared. "You may as well come the rest of the way inside." He set the wood down carefully, eyes fixed on her. "Are you certain?" She nodded. For a moment he simply stared, not blankly, but with the stunned reverence of a man who had once believed his life ended in a frozen grave behind a cabin. Then he crossed to her and dropped to his knees before she could protest, pressing both hands gently around her waist, as if he might steady the whole world by holding this small portion of it. Clara touched his hair. Elias lowered his forehead against her and laughed once, broken and joyful all at once. "I don't know what I did to deserve any of this." She bent and kissed the top of his head. "You stopped turning away." Their son was born in spring with a furious voice and a full head of dark hair that made Mrs. Kettering declare he had arrived already prepared to argue. Elias held the baby like something sacred and breakable the first time, enormous hands impossibly careful beneath a red-faced bundle who quieted the instant he heard his father's heartbeat. Clara watched from the bed, tired and radiant and deeply amused by the awe on Elias' face. "You look frightened," she murmured. "I am." She smiled. "Good. That means you understand the job." The cabin that had once known only grief came alive in ways even Clara had never dared imagine. A cradle stood near the stove, tiny shirts dried by the fire. Elias learned to pace the floor at midnight with a squalling infant tucked against his shoulder, murmuring in a low rumble only babies and mountain winds fully appreciated. Clara laughed at him often and loved him more for every ungainly, tender effort. One evening years later, when their son was old enough to run crooked circles through the yard chasing the thieving dog and shrieking with delight, Elias stood on the cabin step at dusk and watched them. The sky above the ridge had gone gold at the edges. Clara knelt near the garden, gathering herbs into her apron. The boy darted past her. The dog followed. She pretended outrage when they nearly trampled the onions. Both male creatures ignored her with identical confidence. Elias smiled before he realized he was doing it. Clara looked up and caught him. "There it is," she called. the rare weather sign. He crossed the yard, slower now than in younger years but no less solid, and took the herb basket from her while she rose. "You're keeping count?" he asked. "Someone ought to." Their son barreled into Elia's leg at full speed and clung there. Elias lifted him with one arm and set him against his hip as naturally as breathing. The child, full of dust and opinions, immediately began explaining something urgent about frogs near the stream. Clara tucked her hand into Elia's free one as they turned toward the house. He looked at the cabin then, the smoke, the curtains in the window, the scuffed threshold, the blue chair inside that still offended his sense of color and pleased him anyway. Beyond it, if one walked a little way out back beneath the pines, one could find the grave he had once visited like a wound that would never close. He still went there sometimes, not in torment now, in remembrance. He had not betrayed the past by loving again. He knew that at last, love had not replaced what he lost. It had made room beside it. It had carried him forward without asking him to forget. The woman once called useless now stood at the center of everything living in his world. The child on his arm laughed into the evening. The home behind him held warmth enough for all of them. Peace, he had learned, was not the absence of sorrow. It was the presence of life strong enough to stand beside it. As the light faded and the first stars opened above the ridge, Elias drew Clara closer with the hand in his, their son warm against his side, and stepped over the threshold into the house that had once been only a shelter and had become, by grace and courage and one persistent pair of footsteps in the dark, a home. If this story stirred a memory or two, saddle up with us again. Hit subscribe and help this old frontier tales alive. Out here, every name, every trail, every sunset still matter. So, till we meet again, friend, keep your hat tipped to the past and your heart pointed west.